Keeping passwords safe is tricky. I mean, there must be 50 ways to lose a password. And I don't just mean losing the password like forgetting it, but having it stolen. For example, you and I could be on the internet and maybe we're curious about the strength of our password, comparing is it strong enough, complex enough. Maybe we go to a website that checks that for us. If we're going to a website where we're putting in a password and it's telling us just a generic website that says, yeah, your password's super strong, good job, what's your email address, we'll go ahead and send you a report. That's not a good idea. If we're at a certain site that we're logging into and we're putting in a new password for that site, it might have indicators for its strength. But if we're just generically going to a site to test our password strength, there's a good chance that that site is collecting passwords to put into a dictionary type of attack that can be used against us later or against the general population later. So it's really easy to lose a password. Or if on our computer we have malware and there's a keylogger. A keylogger is some software that's running in the background, keeping track of all of our keystrokes and then sending those keystrokes off to the attacker. So if we're putting in a password at the bank or somewhere else and we're putting in our password and that's being logged, now the attacker has our password. So and that's just the beginning. So what can we do to help protect our login authentication if passwords can be fairly easily stolen? And the answer is require something additional above and beyond just the password itself. And we can do that using a technique called multi-factor authentication. Let's take a closer look at exactly what that is. With multi-factor authentication, we have multiple categories or factors that we can require before we believe that Bob is really the user Bob. And let's create 3 categories as a starting point. We'll create category A, category B, and category C. And the idea here is that when someone logs in, if we're using multi-factor authentication, we're going to require at least 2 from different categories. So let's talk about these categories that we may require by a user or from a user before we trust that they are who they say they are. The first category I'd like to identify is something that the user knows. It's knowledge-based. And so things that a typical user might know would be things like a password. Sure, the user could learn their password, know their password, and that would be something the user knows. They could also know a PIN, like a 4-digit or 6-digit PIN that they've been assigned or that they set up. They might know the answers to security questions. Like what street did you grow up on, what's your mother's maiden name, stuff like that. And those would be all examples of things that a user would be able to know. So that's category A. So I'd like to pause right here and just reinforce that if we're only requiring passwords for Bob or another user to log in, all we're asking for that user is something that they know. So just by using passwords alone, we are not using multi-factor authentication because we're only requiring the user to pull from or answer information based on one category. And that's something that the user knows. Now, regarding asking additional information from that user, let's take a look at some additional categories that we could pull from to impose multi-factor authentication and really verify that the user is who they claim to be. And so in the second category here, second category we'll call category B is something that the user has or something that the user possesses. And an example of something that the user might have or that they possess would be, let's say they have a card, a digital card. Now that card could have a magnetic strip or a computer chip on it, but they physically have that card. That card would be something that the user has. Another example could be a physical key fob, a little device that goes in their purse or their pocket. And when they're required to authenticate, we could require that to be present or that to generate a code or a one-time password that would also be required when they wanted to log in. And that one-time password, that could be generated by a hardware device, or we could have an application on the phone of the user or the mobile device of that user, and they could go ahead and generate a one-time password, a one-time code that would be required as something that they have as part of their authentication at that moment in time. Another element would be a security token. And a security token can be represented by many things. It could be generated by a key fob. It could be something that's in a chip on a card. But in either case, it would be something that the user has that they could use as part of the authentication. So if we want to use multi-factor authentication, the secret is we're going to choose at least one from 2 or more factors or areas or groupings here. So if we have a user like Bob, and let's say that Bob is going to authenticate with the bank. Well, the bank is probably going to have a bank card for Bob That would be something that he physically possesses, and he also is likely going to have a PIN, something that he knows. And because we're pulling from two different categories for authenticating Bob, that's an example of multi-factor authentication, or oftentimes called two-factor authentication, because it's pulling from two different categories or two different factors for the authentication. And a third category for multi-factor authentication would be something that the user is. Depends on what the meaning of is. So that would refer to something biological usually. So regarding something the user is with biology, it could be something about the user's eyes. We could do retina scans and iris scans that make sure that that user is who they say they are. Or something regarding their finger or their hand with a handprint or a fingerprint. Or the face, the way their face looks. We could do face recognition. Or their voice. Or the way that they type. And so these are a little bit more to get going because we'd have to register a user with the system and collect the information that we're going to be checking on. So multi-factor authentication is choosing from at least two different categories as part of the authentication process. So these are the three main factors and primary factors in multi-factor authentication. Something that the user knows, something that the user has, and something that the user is. Now we could also include, as part of that, we could include constraints such as location, like the user has to be physically in the building before we're going to allow them to log in. We can also include time and other aspects as well. So what I'd like to do is share with you a couple of multi-factor authentication experiences that I've had in the last 48 hours. And I'd like to, as we go through them together, I'd like us to consider why or if they are truly multi-factor authentication logins. Let's take a look. So for the first scenario here, I set up a new iMac. And this is for my father, who, by the way, loves it. And when setting up that iMac, what it did was we put in his iTunes account, his Apple ID, and then we put in his password, and then it also sent a code to his iPad that we had to confirm and then supply. So my question is that multi-factor authentication? Because it did require his password, something that the user knows. It also required a one-time password that was sent to his other device, something that he had. And because it included one from this category and one from a different category, that indeed is multi-factor authentication at work. And let's take a look at one more example. I happen to use a password manager that is on my computer and my mobile devices. And if I haven't logged on to it for a while, it's going to require a few things. It's going to require my master passphrase. It's also going to require facial recognition from the phone. And it's also going to require a one-time password from a one-time password generator app that I use as part of my security profile. So let's take a look at what was requested for that authentication. And then together we can identify, is that multi-factor authentication, yes or no? So in that example, it was requiring my password or my passphrase. It was also doing a face recognition, which is right here. And it was also requiring a one-time password. So in that case, it was using one of each of these categories. So that's a pretty extreme example of multi-factor authentication using one from each of these three categories. I also want to point out here that in category B, something that the user has or possesses, if we have a smart card with a chip, that smart card could also have a certificate, which would be another example of something that the user has and could use as part of that authentication. So in this video, we've answered the question, what can we do in addition to just using passwords to verify that Bob is really Bob? And the answer is we can choose at least two from the three different factors. Factor one is something that the user knows, like a password. Factor two is something that the user has, like a smart card or a digital certificate or a one-time password. And category three is something that the user is, like biometrics, like a fingerprint scan or an eye scan or the way they type or the way their voice or the way their face looks, that we can use to help verify that the user is really them. So by choosing two out of the three categories and requiring that as part of the login, we are implementing multi-factor authentication. So the cool thing is, even if the password by itself is compromised and somebody steals it, it's not going to be useful if we're implementing multi-factor authentication. So I'm glad we had this time together in this video. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.